it help me make it when I'm having trouble with my boss? What in the world practical difference does it really make? Well, let me show you. If you brought a copy of God's Word, we're in the fourth gospel. There's four: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We're in the fourth gospel, John chapter 1. It is the who of Christmas that makes sense of the what of Christmas and the why of Christmas. Don't you hear this? If Jesus was not who he said he was, we wouldn't have Christmas trees. We wouldn't have Christmas lights. We wouldn't have Christmas carols. We wouldn't have the Christmas season. We wouldn't have Christmas shopping if Jesus was not who he said he was and claimed to be. And in this passage we're going to look at in John chapter 1, one of Jesus' closest friends. You know, Jesus had 12 disciples, but there were three that were kind of his inner circle: Peter, James, and John. So John is writing this gospel about Jesus. John is writing this from the perspective of a man that pretty much for 3 years, nonstop, 24/7, spent every waking moment with Jesus. And he gives us Christmas Theology 101. And what John's going to do for us is really big. He says, you know, if you really want to understand why we celebrate Christmas, and you really want to understand who we celebrate at Christmas, then you need to understand what happened that Christmas. Because three incredible things happened when that baby was born. Number one, Jesus entered into life with us. He entered into life with us. Now, in just 10 words, one sentence, John makes this earth-shattering declaration. He says this: the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Now, if you don't know your Bible, and you maybe have not read this for a long time, you say, well, excuse me, what is the Word? The Word became flesh. He's talking about Jesus. You say, why would he call Jesus the Word? Because words are used to communicate. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm using words to communicate. And what John was saying was, Jesus is literally coming to communicate God to us. He's coming to speak God to us. And John is being physiologically precise as he can be. He said, look, Jesus, the Word, became flesh. Jesus Christ was God who became a human being. As I told you, that's what the word incarnation means. It comes from a Latin phrase that literally means infleshing. So in other words, what John is saying is, God became something that he was never before until that moment 2,000 years ago. He became a human being. Now, here's where people kind of say, man, this is just hard to get my arms around this. God, without ceasing to be God, became a human being. God became a man, the God-man. So, go back to the beginning. He was conceived just like you and I were conceived. He was a fetus for 9 months, an unborn child, just like you and I for 9 months. He came out of a mother's womb as a baby, just like you and me. He could not change himself. He could not feed himself. He could not care for himself. And just like any other baby, he was absolutely physically helpless. Then he became a child. Then he became an adolescent. Then he became a teenager. And he had, just like you and me, skin and bones and veins and corpuscles and eyes and ears. And everything you experience, he experienced. He got tired. He got sleepy. He got hungry. He got thirsty. He got frustrated. He got angry. He laughed. He wept. He bled. He died. Now, he wasn't like Superman. I remember I was telling our 9 to 15 service, I think I've ever told this before. If you said to me, what was your favorite Christmas? I have to tell you one of my favorite, and still to this day, probably my most favorite gift, I was in the first grade. And my mother got me a full-blown Superman outfit. I mean, I had the S, I had the pants, I had the cape, I had the S on the back. I wore myself out trying to get off the ground when I put that suit on. It was. I wanted to sleep with it. I wanted to go to school with it. I loved Superman. He's always been my hero. But Jesus was not like Superman. See, when Superman puts on the glasses and the suit and goes to work at the Daily Planet, one thing doesn't change. He's just Superman. He's not just like us. He is Superman. Jesus is not like Superman. He doesn't just put on glasses. This is not a fake. It's not a disguise. He said, yes, I am God, but I'm also you, just like you. I feel what you feel. I hurt like you hurt. I'm just an ordinary human being. People saw him just like they see us. They heard him like they hear us. They talked to him like they talk to us. They touched him like they touch us. He was absolutely fully human, but he was still God. Now, he took on humanity, but he did not lose his divinity. He was 100% human, and he was 100% God, which, by the way, that's why John added that phrase, he made his dwelling among us. Now, the Greek word for make your dwelling means to pitch a tent or to tabernacle. Had you been a Jew 2,000 years ago and you read that, your jaw would have dropped because you knew exactly what John was talking about. Because back in the Old Testament, when the Jews wanted to meet with God or they wanted to get into the presence of God, they had to go to what was called the tabernacle. It was a tent. And everywhere they traveled as they were making their way to the promised land, they'd set up this tent, they'd set up this tabernacle, and they would go and they would meet with God. Now the problem was they didn't meet with God face to face. It wasn't eyeball to eyeball. It wasn't flesh to flesh. But when they walked into that tabernacle, there was what was called the Shekinah glory of God. It was like this big, great cloud. And they would go in and they would experience the presence of God. And what John is saying is this: when that little baby came out of his mother's womb, God pitched his tent with us. God put his tent down right next to your tent and right next to my tent. So when you met Jesus, had you met Jesus 2,000 years ago, you would have been meeting God face to face. You would have been meeting God eyeball to eyeball. You would have been meeting God flesh to flesh. You know, I had a couple ask me just a while ago after the first service. They said, "Hey, do you go to Israel every year?" And I said, "Well, no, I don't. Usually I go every other year." But I said, "We're going to go back this year, even though we went last year, because so many people want to go." And so, we were talking about it. And he said, "How many times you been?" I said, "I think I've been about 30. I've been to Israel more times than any other country in the world, except, of course, for the United States." And we got to talking, and I said, he said, it must be a great trip. I said, it is. I said, I'll tell you why. I said, I can tell you and describe for you what a thrill it is to get into a boat in Tiberias and take the same boat ride across the Sea of Galilee to Capernaum. I said, it's awesome. I said, I can describe to you how you will literally stand on the same exact street, the same exact cobblestone that Jesus walked to the cross. Unbelievable. I said, I can take you to an empty tomb. We take the Lord's Supper there. It's unlike any other service you'll ever be in. I said, I can take you to Bethlehem. And I preach on Christmas every year. And right behind where I preach are the shepherds' fields, the same fields where shepherds kept their flock, kept watch on their flock by night. And I said, I've got hundreds and hundreds of pictures that I've taken about every conceivable place you would ever want to see in Israel. But I said, you know why you ought to go there? And before I could say anything, he said, yes, because there's nothing like seeing it for yourself. And I said, you're exactly right. And that's exactly why God came to earth. He said, there's nothing like seeing me for yourself. And that's why, listen, not politically correct, but that's why the only way to know God personally is through Jesus Christ. He is not the best way to God. He's not a sweet way to God. He's not a cool way to God. He is the only way to God. He's the only way you can know God. You see, God's revealed himself in creation. God revealed his power. But in Jesus, his person, he said, what's so unique about Christmas is that Jesus, not that just Jesus was God, but in Jesus, God has become a human being. Now let me just say this. I get it, okay? It's impossible that man can become God. You're right. It's inconceivable that God would become man. I agree. It's incredible that Jesus was God, but he became a man. No, let me tell you about it. By the way, if you ever try to compare Christianity with every other religion, I can make this real easy. There are a lot of things that make Christianity not only not a religion, it's not, but there's a lot of things that if it were, would make it totally different from every other religion in the world. Here's just one of them. There is no other faith, there is no other religion in the world that says, if you want to know God as God is, it is essential that you believe that God became a human being. Islam does not teach that. Buddhism does not teach that. Hinduism does not teach that. Judaism does not teach that. We say, if you want to know God, you've got to understand and believe this God became a human being. He came. He entered into life just like us. But there's more. Jesus existed in eternity before us. He entered into life with us, but he existed in eternity before us. Now, John interrupts his own narrative, and he quotes John the Baptist, who says something later on in this chapter, but I want you to listen to what John the Baptist said. John testified concerning him, that is Jesus. He cried out saying, this is the one I spoke about when I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. Now you got to know why that's kind of a big deal that John would say that. John was the cousin of Jesus, okay? His mother and Mary were sisters, and so he was the cousin of Jesus. And so what he's saying here is this. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but he did not have his beginning in Bethlehem. He was born in Bethlehem. He did not have his beginning in Bethlehem. John the Baptist was 3 months older than Jesus. He started his ministry before Jesus. And yet he looks at Jesus and he says, now, I know I'm 3 months older than he is, and I know I started my ministry before he did, but you need to understand, he not only surpassed me, he came before me. And by the way, John makes it very emphatic. He doesn't just say he came before me. In the Greek language, he says he came first before me. That is, John's existence began when John was born. Jesus existed before John was born, and therefore before he was born. I mean, it's important to see Jesus as a human. I get that. But the next thing you've got to understand is this. Jesus is the only human being that was ever born that didn't have a beginning. I had a beginning. My birthday's coming up sooner than I wish. That's when I had my beginning. Whatever birth date you've got, that's when you had your beginning. Jesus never had a beginning. He was conceived by God, but he was not created by God. He was the creator God who has always existed. Now, why is John making a big deal of that? Because he wants you to understand something. The only being before anything or anyone is God. Nothing else has always existed except God. Therefore, if Jesus is God, he could not have had his beginning at Bethlehem. He had his birth, but not his beginning, because God has neither beginning nor ending. Creation did not exist before the Creator. The Creator's always existed before the creation. Our birth was our beginning. His birth was not. Just as he had no beginning, he has no ending. He's always existed from eternity past to eternity present. Now, let me just be honest. That's hard to understand. I got a text this week. I got a text from a buddy of mine who played ball at the University of Georgia, played on the offensive line. He's got some buddies of his who've also played at the University of Georgia. One has a Super Bowl ring. One was a star running back, and there's another guy that played. So he texted me last week and he said, "Doc, I need your help." And I said, "What's going on?" So these three guys, they're kind of, in his words, kind of walking away from Jesus, walking away from God. And one of the problems they have is they can't get their arms around the fact that God has always existed. And I said, well, let me just tell you. I said, they think they have a head problem. They don't. It really is a heart problem. But I said, since they think it's a head problem, let's deal with the head part first. I said, the reason why it's hard to get your hands around that is because we are three-dimensional creatures. We live in a three-dimensional world. God lives in a no-dimensional world. I said, the second problem is we're confined to two things, right? Time and space. I can be here at a certain time on this platform. I cannot be here and at Sanford Stadium at the same time. I can be here at any time, but I can't be here and there anytime. I'm limited by time and I'm limited by space. God created time and God created space. There's no such thing as time or space with God. And I said, that's why you have a problem understanding that. That's why you have to understand about Jesus. He didn't know anything about time or space till he came out of his mother's womb. Jesus was the only baby in history. Think about this. Jesus was the only baby in history that was ever born, that the moment he was born, he was older than his mother and as old as his father. Think about that. He was older than his mother and just as old as his father. And only a baby who was God could fit that description. That's why Christmas, by the way, really is two mysteries in one. Because I'm going to say something now that a lot of pastors are afraid to say. They're afraid that you'll think less of them, or they're afraid you might start questioning things. I'm not, because I know what the scriptures teach. You see, Christmas is a mystery. So what do you mean? Well, let me just state the obvious. Jesus is fully God, and Jesus is fully man. He's not half God or half man. I could get my arm around that. He's 50% God, 50% man. I can get my arms around that. But he's fully God and he's fully man in one person. Now you're saying, I don't understand that. Well, get in line. Neither do I. But you're a pastor. I am. You have a PhD. I do. You read the Greek New Testament every day. But I don't understand that. Oh, but it gets deeper. There's two mysteries I told you. One mystery is you're one person, but you're fully God and you're fully man. However, the story of Christmas is not just about one person. It's actually about three. God the Son was born. But who sent God the Son? God the Father. Well, who conceived God the Son? God the Spirit. So there's three gods. Nope, just one. One God, yep, three persons. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. I don't understand that. Get in line. I don't either. I don't see how that can be. But here's what I know. With God, all things are possible. So I believe in one God. Amen. I believe in one God, but I believe that God came and is in three persons. Jesus entered into life with us, but he existed in eternity before us. He came to live with us as a man, life with us, but he existed in eternity before us, God. But when you add all that up, this is the best thing. Jesus expresses God to us. Now listen to what John says. John takes this theological present and he ties it up with this nice theological bow with these words. He says, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God. Just hold on to that thought. And is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. Now, John reminds his readers that no one's ever seen God. And 2,000 years ago, nobody would have disagreed with that statement. Everybody understood that. Everybody got that. Because if you go back and read ancient literature, here's what you'll find. All these people that believed in these mythological gods like Zeus and Hercules and all these mythical gods and all these other pagan gods that they worship, they were both fascinated and frustrated at the same time. They were fascinated because they did believe in these gods. They believed there were pagan. They believed something was up there, something greater than them. They gave them different names. They had different powers. They had different properties. But they just believed, yes, there is a great, great, great God up there. That's what fascinated them. But what frustrated them was the knowledge that they could never know that God. They could never know, does that God know me? Does that God even care about me? Does that God love me? Does that God have a plan for my life? Can I have a relationship with that God? Can I ever personally know that God? They were so convinced they could not that the philosopher Plato said this: never man and God can ever meet. Plato said, you want to worship your God, you worship your God. You want to celebrate your God, you celebrate your God. You want to elevate your God, you elevate your God. You want to get excited about your God, you get excited about your God. Just understand this: you'll never meet that God. You'll never know that God. You'll never have a personal relationship with that God. Even every Jew knew that God said to Moses thousands of years ago, you cannot see my face and live, Moses. Nobody can see me and live. So John says, no one has ever seen God. But then he throws in this little 3-letter Christmas word, but. But. And then he refers to Jesus as the one and only Son. And then these are the words that cracked windows. These are the words that tore down walls. These are the words that destroyed buildings. Who himself is God. Amen. And Jewish jaws dropped all over Israel. Excuse me? He himself is God. Literally, he is the one unique God. And if John were standing here right now, and you said to John, hey John, I'm kind of preaching on Christmas. Let me just ask you a question, John. What is Christmas to you? John would say, oh, that's easy. I can tell you what Christmas is to me in 3 words. Jesus is God. That's Christmas. Jesus is God. He is God the Son, but he's always been God. There was never a time when he was not God. But there was a time when he was not human, because it was not until that first Christmas that the God of eternity, who doesn't know either time or space, entered into both. Jesus was not a humanized God. He wasn't a deified man. He was the God-man. So when you met Jesus here, whether you realized it or not, you were meeting someone that everything that God was, he was. Everything that God is, he is. He was all of that. You can't take God out of the man, and you can't take man out of the God. He was not God with a touch of humanity. He was not man with a touch of divinity. He was fully God and fully man. And the reason John says that's so important is because of what he came to do. Now, these next 4 words made Jews fall out. He has made God known. No, Plato, you're wrong. God and humanity can meet. They do meet in Jesus. The word there in the Greek language to make God known, that word gives us the English word exegesis. And the word exegesis simply means to explain. And what John is saying is, Jesus is the explanation of God. Everything God is, Jesus is. Everything God has, Jesus has. Everything that God does, Jesus does. So, for example, I want to say to you, hey, you want to come to God? Yes, I really do. Come to Jesus. You want to know God? Man, I really do. Know Jesus. You want to love God? I really do. Love Jesus. Because in Jesus, you don't just see God. In Jesus, you don't just hear God. In Jesus, you don't just feel God. In Jesus, you know God. And not just as creator, not just as ruler, not just as king, not just as master, not just as redeemer. You know how you know God in Jesus? As a human being, just like you and just like me. I read a story the other day. I never knew this. This is something I've never shared because I didn't know it. But it's a fascinating story. When I read it, I said, that's one of the best Christmas stories I've ever read. On February the 15th, 1921, in New York City, in the operating room of the Kane Summit Hospital, a doctor performed an appendectomy. Now, that in and of itself is not a big deal. Somebody somewhere around the world is either getting an appendectomy right now, or they think they are, but it's their brain, okay? But I'm telling you, appendectomy is not a big deal. Somebody's getting one probably done right now. This doctor, by the way, who's doing this surgery, Dr. Evan O'Neill Kane, he examined the patient that he operated on, and he said, no doubt about it, he clearly has a case of appendicitis. And Dr. Kane knew what he was talking about, because in 37 years of practicing medicine, he had performed 4,000 appendectomies. So you would think on this particular day, it's just another routine appendectomy surgery, except there were two things that day that made this surgery unique, and there were two things that day that made this surgery unlike any other surgery that had ever been done in history. Dr. Kane had been looking for a while for a volunteer, someone that was willing to undergo surgery for an appendectomy without being put to sleep. Just local anesthesia. Staying awake the entire time. Well, guess what? People didn't line up out the door to be the first guy to give that a shot. Okay? I mean, nobody. Because when he would explain, hey, I'm telling you, I know it's safe, I know it will work, nobody wanted to do it. Number one, some people said, I don't want to be awake when you're cutting me open. And a lot of people said, yeah, but what if the anesthesia wears off too quickly? So Dr. Kane couldn't find a candidate, and he was so frustrated because he kept telling his colleagues, I'm telling you, we need to get away from a lot of anesthesia. It's dangerous, and it is. It's risky when you go, when they put you to sleep. And he said it would be so much safer to just do, to locally anesthetize a patient. And they agreed with him. They thought he was right, but nobody wanted to give it a shot. So Tuesday morning, February the 15th, this historic operation takes place. He finally found a candidate that was willing to do it. So the patient was prepped. He was wheeled in the operating room. The local anesthetic was applied. And as he had already done over 4,000 times, Dr. Kane dissected that tissue. He removed the appendix. He sewed him back up. He took him into post-op. He was placed in a room. He recovered so quickly, he was out of the hospital in 2 days. And Dr. Kane was elated because he had finally proven his theory to be correct. And thanks to that brave volunteer, Dr. Kane was able to make medical history. But that's just the one first thing that made this so unique. It's the first time anybody ever had their appendix removed without being put to sleep. But it was the second thing that made it really unique, because the patient that Dr. Kane operated on was Dr. Kane. He operated on himself. He applied the anesthetic. He cut himself open. He took out his appendix. He sewed himself back up. He operated literally on himself. I read that story and I thought, what an incredible story. And then it hit me like a ton of bricks. It can't compare to the Christmas story of the God who became flesh. And you know why? To take his own medicine. Because see, some of you sitting out here right now, and Christmas is tough for you. And here's why Christmas is tough for you. Because you're suffering physically, emotionally, mentally. You're suffering. You know suffering. Yeah, do I really? So did Jesus. You know disappointment. So does Jesus. You know betrayal. So does Jesus. You know hurt and heartache? So does Jesus. You know what it's like when a person you thought would take a bullet for you would die for you, your best friend, turned tail and ran and turned his back on you? So did Jesus. You know heartache, you know hurt, you know hopelessness, you face death. So did Jesus. He experienced all of it as a man, but he overcame all of it as God. You know why? Because he wanted to come and say, listen, I'm not above you, I'm with you. I'm one of you. I'm going to go through everything you go through. We're going to do life together because I'm going to do it just like you. I'm not taking any exemptions. I'm not taking any exceptions. I'm going to go through the junk and the dirt and the mud and the hurt and the heartache and the disappointment and the disillusionment and the discouragement just like you. And let me tell you, it is amazing how God still shows up today. Today. He still shows up today. I told you we went to the mall yesterday. And I'll be honest, we had to park. We parked in Gainesville. Took a bus to the mall.